Okay. Welcome to the webinar, A Framework for Youth Individual Empowerment. A race webinar with Ali Hrasok. I am going to explain to you how to use the features that we have here for Zoom. We have closed captioning, and to use it, click the caption button here, and it will pop up over there. And then we also have Spanish interpretation. Tenemos interpretación en español para los que necesiten. Van a ver en la banda o cinta negra un globo que indica interpretation. Hagan clic aquí, luego seleccionan español y oprimen donde dice Mute Original Audio. Esto último filtra completamente la presentación en inglés para que puedan escuchar con claridad a Patricia. And then we have interpretation in ASL. And to do that, we will pin the interpreter, which is Dina. She will say a few words. And yes, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Hello.
Yes, we will pin her. So you can see her over there, but you can also pin her on your own. To pin the interpreter, hover over the video of the particular person you want to pin and click. So there are 3 little dots over the person's name. You can click over there and you will see that you can pin anybody. So to pin Dina Hazen, who is our interpreter for ASL, do that. Then we have Josie.
Welcome, everyone. It's so exciting to be here, and it's hard to believe that this is our April webinar. Today, we have the privilege of having a dear friend back, Ali Hrasok, who is a training expert specialist in higher education and has years, I hate to say that, Ali, but maybe near a decade or half of engagement, practice, and work with young adults and youth with disabilities. And so this is actually the 4th out of 5 Toolkit webinars. We have already had 3 done. If you have not watched them, number one, they are on the racecenter.org website. But otherwise, we will be updating our site between now and June. And so I'm excited that we will have a youth engagement section in our resources that will make this so much easier to find. And so today we are going to be looking at individual youth engagement, how to really empower individuals beyond just working in our small groups or our bubbles. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Ali.
Thank you so much, Josie. I'm so excited to be back. Yes, you can say it, Josie. It's been over a decade that I've been working with youth and young adults and volunteering. So I'm over it that it's been that long, so we can talk about that. As Josie mentioned, and we can go to the next slide if you would like to, I'm here with Raise. I wear a lot of different hats in this arena, but I'm happy to have been able to develop some of the toolkits that Josie mentioned. We are kind of building each time that we launch a new toolkit, and there will be yet another one after this. So we hope you join us again next month. And Josie, I don't know if you want to pop back on screen just to speak a little bit about what Raise is. For those that may not know on the call.
That sounds like a brilliant idea. Thanks, Ali. So the Raise Center has been funded by the Rehab Service Administration since 2014. You obviously would not think that I've been in charge since then. So I don't even introduce it. But it works with parent centers across the country to improve transition support for youth with disabilities and their families. And thank you, Ali.
No problem. So I just wanted to give that context because I think everything that Josie just mentioned really leads us right into why we developed this Toolkit series, really to support the parent center professionals, all of you, in creating programming that is centered around youth development and beyond. So Josie mentioned sort of going even outside of our support bubble and doing youth leadership activities and systems change outside of our organization. So we will get to that and talk more about that. But so far, I just kind of wanted to bring us up to speed. We've had youth engagement toolkit as a general idea about how to engage youth in your organization. And then we started to discuss more specific pieces of that youth engagement. So youth development and youth leadership development is even more specific to that. Next slide. So I want to talk before we really get into all of it. I want to speak a bit with all of you. So before I do that, I'm going to mention two features of Zoom that we can utilize today. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a chat function and a Q&A function. The Q&A is a really great place for all your general questions, any technical issues that you're having, because our friends here at Raise can probably answer some of those questions as we move along. The chat function, on the other hand, I will probably rely more heavily on as the presenter to interact with all of you as much as possible in these virtual settings. Throughout the training, I will be asking questions, asking for volunteers so that we can work on some applicability of what we're discussing. So I want you guys to be ready with your chat function to interact with me. I think it makes for a much better experience and training for all of you. So please be ready for that. So we're going to test it out with some introductory stuff. We introduced ourselves. I want to know a couple things from all of you. So one would be what role you most identify with. So I just give some examples here. You can see parent, professional, a parent center representative, or maybe something else. And if you've utilized some of the other toolkits that we mentioned before, I want to know that too. So I am going to monitor the chat. I'm going to give folks a few, not a few minutes, but maybe a minute or so to reply, and I'll read some of them out as we go. So
Clarification, Ali, are you
Yes.
wanting them in the chat or in the question Q&A?
Excellent clarification. In the chat. So anytime I'm asking you guys a question that I want you to answer, please use the chat function, because that's what I'm going to have pulled up on my screen. Seeing a lot of parent center people identifying most as a parent center representative. Awesome. Have some folks that use toolkits already. That's great to see. You can also have, I didn't say this, but I usually do. You can have multiple roles. You can say that I identify as a parent and a parent center representative. You can wear multiple hats. That's allowed. Awesome. I saw staff and supporter. I like that. There we go. Now we're getting the multiple roles. So parent center professional, sibling, and family member of an individual with a disability. Very cool. And folks from all over the country, that's awesome to hear. I'm seeing Missouri, Alabama, Wisconsin, Oregon. Testing my acronym knowledge. I appreciate that. Awesome. So lots of folks that have reviewed the previous toolkits. As Josie mentioned, if you have not looked at those toolkits yet, they are and will be continuing to be available to you. So please go back and review them as we send out our new toolkits, we're going to try to put links directly in them back to our other toolkits as well, so that you can access them more easily. Awesome. Some folks are mentioning like what their exact roles are, which I appreciate. Hopefully we get to chat a little bit more throughout the presentation, but I appreciate that you guys were willing to interact with me in the chat. So keep that function open. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I always like to start the training, obviously with introductions, but then also centering us around what our goals are today. So next slide. When we think about just today, this training, what our goals are, we're going to be providing context and relevance for the content of what's in the slides. We're going to discuss the general structure of the toolkit and how it can be used. And then lastly, we're going to be providing some content level examples. So like I mentioned, actually going in there with all of you, hopefully getting a volunteer or two to discuss that section of the toolkit and how you could use it in your specific group or how it could be applied to other groups that you may have. We have an overarching goal to really leave this webinar with a tool that you can use to continue to engage youth and support their development. For anyone that was on the webinars that I did for the previous toolkits, I think I mentioned that I really want to provide all of you with the skills and the tools necessary for you to apply this in your own work. I don't want this to feel like we're throwing a bunch of content at you that you have to figure out what to do with all of that. I want our focus today to be how to use these things that we've known work throughout our experience. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the importance of our toolkit that we're discussing today in general. Go ahead. We are, again, if you had been on other webinars, you've probably heard me talk about the youth engagement continuum, but I think it deserves a revisit. So we're really looking at this big picture of a graphic that I have on the screen of the youth engagement continuum, and I'm going to describe that a bit. So you can see at the bottom, we have very clearly a process, right? So it goes from intervention stages. These are more of our youth services approaches. So what service are we providing to youth? The toolkits that we talked about most recently were the youth development and youth leadership toolkits. And that really spans across the processes of development, starting to get into that collective empowerment stage. So really focused on building individual skills for our youth and young adults so that they can be successful in their own lives, and then a step beyond that, be leaders in their own lives. Now we're moving a bit more down this continuum into solidly the collective empowerment and even systemic change side of things. So this graphic here describes those steps as including civil engagement and youth organizing. When we talked with stakeholders and looked at it from our youth service, youth support professional perspective, we thought about how that really involves youth individual empowerment. So empowering individual youth to see their role as leaders in the greater community. And then that final step of youth collective empowerment. So really working within groups as individuals, but also collectively. So if you want to click one more, can show where our focus will be today is really, go back one more slide for me. Perfect. So we're not quite at the end, but we are getting there. Josie mentioned starting to work a bit outside of our bubble, and that's where we want to end up. But for now, we're going to focus on how we use those skills that we learned in the development and youth leadership stage to empower our youth to start acting, to start making real change, and putting the work in that we have all done as well, and we want to empower them to do the same. Okay, now we can go. So structure of the toolkit, my brain thinks in outline. So that's typically how I present things to all of you. So we can go to the next slide. We have 5 key components in this toolkit. Each of those components is almost like a section within the toolkit where we will talk about 2 things. So first in the toolkit, we'll provide very brief background, some literature-based explanation of what we mean by that component of youth individual empowerment. And then the second piece to each of those components is going to be what we call a framework. So that's a general translation of those components to your work with youth. Ideally, this is providing a starting point to start to really individualize at your agency. If you look at the toolkits previous to this, we used kind of conversation starters so that you were working with your colleagues. We took notes from what your feedback was from the last one to provide some more specific examples. So we hope that we are providing that in this toolkit. Go ahead. So we are going to get right into the content of youth individual empowerment. I will say we are hot off the presses. It's our first draft of the toolkit. So we're going to be trying to switch back and forth between this PowerPoint and some actual pages from the toolkit so that you all can see inside the toolkit. And as we're doing some of that application, you'll be able to see right on the page exactly what it's going to look like. So you'll have to bear with us as we switch between screens. So next slide. Overarching, again, my brain thinks in outline, so I wanted to give you big picture first. So 5 key components that will be included in this toolkit. The first is modeling. So learning behaviors through imitation. If we have any teachers in the room, I feel like this will be a very familiar concept to you. The second, showcasing impact, probably one of my favorites. This is really drawing connections between the efforts that our youth are making and the results of those efforts. Empower their passion is our third component. So this is connecting passion with the skills that each individual has. Fourth would be increasing awareness and knowledge. For that, we're going to talk a bit about acknowledging the background and context of what they're doing and what their skills are. And then the last thing that we're going to discuss in this toolkit is a component of setting them up for action, which will lead us right into our toolkit that we'll discuss next month. This is really focused on building individual capacity for independence outside of our organizations and the work that they do with us. Awesome. Okay, next slide. I should also mention, if you have questions about what we're talking about here, please also put that in either the chat or the Q&A. Like I said, I have the chat open, so I'm trying to monitor that as we go, and I will try to pull in those questions if I see them. Okay, so we are going to start with the first component, which is modeling. So just giving, similar to the structure of the toolkit, I'm going to give a little bit of background, and then we're going to go more into the framework and the application piece of things. So modeling is, like I said, very, very familiar in the teacher world. So we're really imitating behavior or showing behavior that we want another person to model themselves after, which is so critical in our youth being able to feel empowered themselves. So when we think about modeling, we're really acknowledging the fact that you all have such a critical role in their advancement. If you've been with us for a bit, I say use the term adult ally quite a bit. As a youth adult ally, or somebody that is really championing youth voice and is supporting them, they're looking to you to see where their fit is in your organization. So we want to make sure that we are modeling appreciating youth voice and modeling leadership in and of itself. So a little bit of background just about what is included with good modeling. There are 4 components to that: engaging, maintaining, owning, and motivating. So a lot of this we probably think of just as general good practice, but I think this lays it out really nicely. So when we think about engaging, we are not just grabbing somebody's attention, but really grabbing their attention through meaningful participation. So not just somebody watching or listening, but actively engaging in that process. In the maintenance phase, then, youth begin to expect their own involvement. This is really important. So this should be routine behavior or a routine action that they're going to be involved. So we're maintaining their engagement by allowing them to expect this to happen. In the ownership phase, this will be when you start to see youth and young adults behaving similarly to what they've seen in their context, which again is supported by a routine situation or routine opportunities to do so. In the motivation stage is when outcomes start to increase their connection to the work. So I want to point out something as we get started. You'll hopefully see how all of these things are really interconnected with one another. And we can draw those connections as we go. So some of what you saw in the key components you'll hear again and again, especially with the motivations stage. So outcomes being connected to their efforts to increase their connection to the work. This last bullet is so important too, where we are combining these sorts of principles in everyday interactions. So when we're talking about modeling, we are not saying, okay, go into a meeting and think, now I'm going to behave in a way that I'm going to model for my youth and young adults. We're saying that you should really internalize these ideas and behave in ways knowing that our youth and young adults will model their behavior after you. So every time you're interacting with them, every time you're interacting with your coworkers around youth and young adults, they're watching and listening and internalizing that behavior themselves, and will end up modeling it. So make sure you're very conscious of your behavior in that sense. All right, so I'm going to have our friends here stop sharing, and I'm going to share the framework. I'm going to bring it up first. There we go. Can folks see that?
Yes, Sally.
Thank you, Marianne. Okay, so our framework for modeling, again, I think somebody mentioned PowerPoint and toolkits will be available to you all. So you get to really get in there. I'm absolutely going to make it bigger. Hang on. Moving all of our heads around so I can get to it. As you all know, Zoom likes to put our faces over top of words. Okay, is that good, Denise? And anybody else? Awesome. Okay. Thank you guys for letting me know. So for modeling, we have some big picture ideas of how you can do modeling and some smaller picture ideas. I'm going to briefly go over this, and then I want somebody to hopefully volunteer to talk to us a bit about that. So I would like somebody to get up the courage to volunteer while I go over this, okay? So in small ways, again, we're thinking about modeling in our everyday interactions. So something extremely simple like asking their opinion. And this could be on a lot of different things. So what topics matter to them? When and where do they even want to meet? What would they like to prioritize in terms of their activities? Or just simple getting to know them, but making sure that it's clear that you respect and are interested in what they have to say. Next thing we have here is lead meetings with youth in mind. So I know as a professional, meetings are not always my favorite thing to attend. But as a youth and young adult, when I attended meetings, it was even more intimidating. I wasn't sure where my voice fit in a meeting. And as youth service professionals, it's our job to make sure that we are leading meetings in a way that fits and creates environments that our youth will be able to interact with. So some things we have here: call out when youth voice is not being considered, being aware of your own behavior and language and how it impacts the culture of your organization. So this brings up that great point again about how it's not just when our youth are in the room, but it's when they're not as well. And we want our behavior and our actions to be consistent across all of those things. Include them in the conversation. So we don't just want to show up to a group meeting or to some activity that's all neatly packaged. We want to bring them along for the whole process. We want them to be actively engaged, to own what they're doing. And that sometimes means adjusting, maybe adjusting the time of the meeting so that they can be involved, utilizing technology in ways that they can get even bigger or greater access to what you're doing. So you kind of have to think across a lot of those different access points. Okay. I absolutely can expand. That's a great idea. Maybe. Oh, of course, now it went to.
Hey, we have a question, Ali.
Cool.
So I think that this is a really important question for
Yeah.
parent centers who are really strung thin. So
Yeah.
very few self-advocates reach out to our parent center for one-on-one support. Our staff resources are pretty full tap by responding to family, caregivers, and professionals who directly ask for help. How do we develop a method to find youth, engage youth, and develop youth leadership within our current structure? And I did mention, but want to mention out loud, the toolkit number 2 and toolkit number 3 on youth development and youth leadership are great starts. And I think that it's silly for any of us to think that we aren't all kind of strung thin here. And sometimes the amount of work that you're doing with families, you can't imagine. Adding one more thing, but I don't like the word but because it means otherwise. And we know that in the long run, what we are trying to do is support young adults, youth, to ultimately live their best lives. And that means supporting families and youth. And I would say for many of us, myself included, Ali included, many of us were drugged along to parent events that were youth leadership events advertised by parent centers because our parents thought it'd be good for us. And we might not have wanted to be there, but they changed our lives. And so, I think that holding family and youth events are really important, or just advertising through youth. But I wanted to throw that back to you, Ali, as well.
No, it's a very good question. And I typically actually start some of these presentations by discussing some of that. So I'm glad that somebody called that out, because it's very relevant. A lot of what we discuss here in our toolkits is like our magical world where if everything was perfect, we could do all of these things and be perfect youth support professionals. But that's not really the case. And I try, we all try, all of us stakeholders try to put in these toolkits some of those small ways that we can be engaging youth, developing youth, and including them, because we recognize that situations are not always ideal, but we have to start somewhere. So I'm glad that Josie brought up the earlier toolkits. I think that you'll find some helpful tips in there, especially about what to or how to start some of those conversations with the colleagues that you work with, and how you can be sharing those responsibilities. I will say, and I think some of the adult allies that I've worked with in my time, in my decade that I've been working with youth and young adults, is that they start to rely more and more on the youth. So I mentioned, even just in this modeling slide, not trying to feel like you have to package up activities nice and neat in order to present and facilitate with the youth. Really, you're creating the context, creating the parameters and the environment for youth to run this ideally on their own, or as independently as possible. And that's not something that is going to happen overnight, but these toolkits are hopefully moving everyone in that direction. And I know that I think the individuals on this call right now, who is hopefully, along with Josie and our other friends at Raise, who are going to be helping with some of that process as well. So maybe if we have time at the end, Josie, you can make a plug for all of that stuff too. Okay. And Josie's adding awesome information. I'm going to keep going. Do I have a volunteer yet? Somebody that would like to talk through modeling at their agency? If not, I can just keep going. I did try, that was a great suggestion for somebody to expand this, but then it puts too much information on one page. So we're gonna hopefully stick. Like I said, you will have access to these. So we're just for now going over as much as we can. Okay, so some bigger picture ideas. I know we were trying to bring it back down to small, but I'm gonna expand our mind a bit again, and talk about some really big ways that you can ideally eventually get to with our youth and young adults. So we want you in modeling to go through the process of leadership with them. What we mean in terms of this is nobody becomes a leader overnight. We all have had plenty of experience in maybe running a meeting or doing an activity, and we want to bring the youth along with us in that process. So progressively giving them those opportunities while you're doing some parallel learning with them. Utilize those strength-based approaches, building confidence in the individual skills that they have and the strengths that you've identified, and helping them to identify what those strengths are. Sometimes that means trial and error. Sometimes it just means a conversation, but really putting the work in to identify what those strengths are and using them to their advantage. Along with that, once you find those skills, you can really work to identify and appoint youth to meaningful positions. Here we want to avoid tokenism. Do not want youth to just be at the table to be at the table. We want them to have meaningful roles that actively engage them in the process. So identifying areas of need within your group, we were just mentioning that a lot of times we're short-staffed. We feel like we are working endlessly on all of our different responsibilities. What can we be taking off of our plate and giving to youth that are surrounding some of their strengths? And if it's based off of their strengths, that task cannot be too big or too small. Last thing we have on here, develop and provide templates for some of these processes. So if you do have a group of youth that are working on their own goals and outcomes, help them to identify what a meeting agenda looks like, how the planning process works, even what budgets are and how to budget for things. So really developing some of these administrative and technical skills that are going to, again, help them outside of our little bubble, either in the workforce or in other volunteer opportunities. We had a great suggestion in the chat. Having more than one youth at a meeting, if at all possible, helps to avoid tokenism. Absolutely. We've been in plenty of meetings, I think, where only one youth is brought to the table. And it really puts pressure, I think, on that individual as well. Whereas if we feel that collective power as a youth, becomes a bit easier to speak up as well. So Miriam, if you want to share the PowerPoint again, I'm going to go to the next section. Awesome. You can hit a couple slides. I skipped over so we didn't have to keep going back. One more. Awesome. Thank you so much. So our next one is showcasing impact. I'm going to speed up a little bit, not in my actual speech, but I'm going to kind of go through these slides a bit quicker because I'm looking at our time here. So showcasing impact is this big phrase, but what do we really mean by that? So we want to increase the motivation by connecting involvement to results. We all know as professionals, it is so discouraging to feel like we worked incredibly hard for little to no results, or that we don't get to see the impact of all of the work that we put in. So we want to help our youth see that. We want them to recognize that what they're doing is making an impact in the organization, even if it is incredibly small to them. With this, follow through is absolutely key. So you're not just providing the opportunity, you're helping to support their decision, and then you're looping back with them to showcase that outcome to them. Here is something that is, I mean, I cannot stress this part enough, but failure does not equal a negative outcome. So sometimes I think our adult allies or our champions are afraid of the youth failing, or afraid of showing them that something that they had an idea about failed. And I put quotations around fail because I don't think that it's a fail. But we want to instead bring that to their attention and work through that with them. So impact can occur throughout the entire process. So somebody mentioned too about creating structure that helps to support youth feeling in control and feeling valued. And this is one of those things. Just being involved in the process is making an impact, regardless of whatever the result is. It emphasizes the idea that it's so important to discuss results and really process through that. You know, what worked, what didn't work, what can we do better in the future? And again, just finding their value in the role that they have within the organization. I'm reading, we can go, if you actually stop sharing, Miriam, I will share again. Thank you. And then I noted some ideas in the chat, so I want to read through that. So it was noted that some youth need one-on-one support. And then they actually start to make some progress once you give that support. Absolutely. I want to say in some of our previous toolkits and definitely in the next one for next month, we will talk about roles more specifically, and the fact that being a leader doesn't necessarily mean that you're running a meeting, but it means that whatever your strengths are being valued. So absolutely, if youth need one-on-one support in doing whatever they're doing, then that's completely fine. There can still be value and leadership found within that. So some things here in our framework of showcasing impact. In the short term, you want to be showing youth that their suggestions were relayed in some other meeting. So even if they aren't included in the meeting themselves, make sure you're telling them that what they suggested or their feedback was included in some way. You want to build your trainings, whether it be for internal employees, for new hires, anything like that. You want to be able to build that with their perspective in mind. As you're building trainings, maybe out across your state or whatever the case may be, you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from youth, especially if it's about them. Again, we're circling back to this routine idea. So asking them for their feedback more routinely, setting up that expectation that that will be your approach in the future as well. Making those connections. So just really being intentional about pointing out where they may have made a difference. Especially when youth are new to this work, they're going to have a hard time finding where that impact is. So it's our job to find that and point that out to them. In the long term, again, in our ideal world, and not just ideal, this has happened plenty of times, our systems work from the top down, but we want to be empowering youth and showing them that they can make policy change, whether it be within your organization, in your state, or beyond. Program development. So as you develop new programs in your organization, or maybe start a program for youth, you want to include them in that process. Diversify your membership within that. There's so much peer mentoring and learning that can occur through that process. Some groups that I've been a part of have found even better results by including maybe a broader range of individuals that could be involved in the group. And lastly, on this slide too, we have increasing responsibilities. I think the term that I used last was progressive. So not just sort of throwing them in and expecting them to figure it out, but incrementally providing them with opportunities that can increase their responsibility or leadership. Okay. Miriam, you mind going back to your PowerPoint? Okay. And we're going to go all the way to empowering their passion. Thank you. So our passions often follow our strengths. If you've ever thought about what you're most passionate about, it's probably something that you're at least a little bit good at. It's just how we as humans work. We tend to like things that we are can be successful at, or that we value in our lives as well. So in teams specifically, we talk sometimes about this competing values framework and the idea that different individuals that have different values and the fact that that's diverse within one team is actually beneficial to the group as a whole. So in the toolkit, you'll find ideas about collaborating, creating, controlling, and competing, and how those values within individuals can work together collectively. So it's something that you can help to identify within your individual youth members. Valued membership stems from an empowered purpose. So we want to make sure, again, that we're having complementary styles within groups. I put here a common model about like working styles that I think is an easy place to start with youth, and it's the DISC model. I'm not going to bring up our PDF, but essentially it is dominants, which are folks who like to lead discussions, maybe facilitate a training, be a spokesperson for a group, or identify objectives for that group. Influencers, as they're called, really like the networking aspect of groups. They like the social media stuff. They like to think of marketing and branding. They're really good at building some of those team building exercises as well. The ESC in DISC is for steadiness. So our steady folks are people who really like to stick to the rules, maintain the mission of a group, support new members coming in. They're excellent people for like a point person for collaboration or for organizing an event because they always stay very grounded. Our C in DISC is compliant. So a little bit similar, but definitely more on the data side of things. So they're excellent at collecting data, keeping track of what's going on at the meetings. Maybe they're like your historian or secretary for the meeting as well. And sometimes our folks in this area are also good at budgeting. So it's just a little bit of a perspective of how you can start to organize or think about values and skills within the youth that you work with, and helping them to identify what they really enjoy and empowering them to lean on those strengths. All right, our next slide. See if I missed anything. One more. Okay. One thing that I missed on here is just really clarifying the strengths and passions. I think it's helpful as an adult ally for you all to think about it. Maybe as I read some of those things, you were thinking of youth or young adults that you've worked with. And it's worth exploring that with the youth themselves because they may have completely different ideas than what you think of for them. Okay, our next slide. Okay, increasing our awareness and knowledge. Again, another very broad idea that could mean a lot of things. We're going to try to narrow that down a bit, but starting out a little bit broad, it's a comprehensive approach to gaining knowledge. So you don't just want to think about specific items that are right in front of you. We really want our youth to start to think about a more global perspective. So thinking about themselves, thinking about those that they work or interact with, and the community itself that they are within. We want to recognize that there are different types of knowledge. In some of our previous toolkits, we spoke about traditional models of intelligence and knowledge acquisition. And we really want to, again, remind folks that there are so many different ways that we can be aware or have knowledge about our world. So we go over some of those different types of knowledge in the first part of this section. And then we talk about how we want to apply both direct and experiential learning to what the work is that they're doing. So again, empowering and informing through a variety of opportunities to help gain knowledge in a lot of those different areas, and required to lead and direct their life and interact with other individuals. All right, I am going to share my slides. So Miriam, if you would stop sharing again for me, because I really love our graphic on this. I think it's helpful. Okay, I know this might be a little small, guys, so bear with me. So increasing knowledge, a great place to start. Again, like I mentioned, we're going to be linking to our other toolkits where we feel like it's most relevant. That's a great place to start for some of this, especially when we're talking about increasing our awareness and knowledge of ourselves, because that's ultimately where it starts. We mentioned this in modeling, but it bears repeating. Parallel learning, so bringing those youth into routine meetings, making sure that they are learning about the nuts and bolts of these processes, so that we can eventually start to provide them with opportunities to do that themselves. Being really intentional about our teaching moments. So again, trying to build that confidence. The more and more that people experience these things, whether it be directly or indirectly, is going to help them in the long run. And learning about how we got to where we are. So some of that history piece of things. Why have youth not been involved historically, and why are they being involved now? Maybe even their own personal history. Josie mentioned that a lot of us were sort of dragged to some of these first opportunities. And I think those are interesting stories to tell, to take some of the pressure off of the youth that may not feel like they really want to be at a meeting, or aren't sure that they fit where they currently are. So ideally, again, ideal world, where we want to be going is to really create these communities and shared experiences. Again, we had that suggestion to bring multiple youth to a meeting. The more and more we're bringing them together, the more that they can begin to talk about their roles in the larger community context. So having moments where we're sharing those experiences is incredibly helpful to that process. Specifically doing activities or creating opportunities where they're getting involved in the community is another way to talk about those shared experiences and to begin to have our youth see themselves in a bigger picture. Here, it's really critical for us to highlight encouraging youth to join other boards and other organizations that might align with their passion. So not just the work that they're doing with all of you, but what else is available to them that they can become a part of. And practice. One of the greatest ways that we increase our awareness and knowledge is by trying and not being afraid of that failure. All right, Miriam, you want to share that our last piece for me? Our last component that we are going to talk about is setting them up for action. So we can skip right to that slide. One more. Perfect, thank you. So increasing youth capacity to act on their own. We ended that last component by talking about starting to get out in the community, beginning to have those conversations about shared experiences, and actually practicing some of those skills that we've been hopefully developing and ideally leading in their own lives. So now we want to set them up to take all of what they've learned and go and do other things that they might be passionate about. So for this, we really talk about that youth adult partnership, or what I have been referring to as well as the youth adult ally. Any youth adult partnership that is successful has some components to that as well. So things like deliberately acting together. So hinting at some of that modeling or parallel learning. A democratic decision-making process. So there's no power struggle there. Everybody's voice matters. Everyone has equal say in what's happening. Successful youth adult partnerships are also long-term. So that speaks to the question earlier, I think, and Josie's point to get involved in multiple youth and family events. It might take seeing a youth quite a few times before they are able to trust and engage in a partnership with you, and then trust that that's going to last beyond one event. Shared work. So again, not just taking all of that ownership onto yourself, but really sharing some of those responsibilities that with the youth that you work with. And lastly, promoting positive change lends itself to successful youth adult partnerships. This is really circling back to something we talked about earlier in showcasing impact, but supporting the entire process of any kind of opportunity or action. So we spoke about providing opportunities, supporting decision-making, and then telling folks about the outcome. But two components that we added in here are the support and the accountability piece. So when working with youth, we really want to make sure that we are holding them accountable to what we've decided together collectively that they're going to be working on, because that helps them build responsibility and leadership in and of itself. And I will share my screen one last time, Miriam, I promise you. And we are going to talk a little bit about, and by little, I mean very little because we are running out of time, successful model that a group that I have worked with and our youth stakeholders who helped on this project, the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network, they talk about this idea of a sandbox with their adult allies. And by sandbox, what they really mean is that their adult allies are sort of providing the perimeters, giving them tools, setting them up for opportunities, but allowing them a lot of flexibility to create their own path, or to have their own ideas within that. So some components of that we find are successful include these on the left side, and I will read them to you now. So providing some sort of goal for our youth to work on, right? So giving them an end goal that they need to work towards, giving them the boundaries of how, what they have to work with, maybe some more details about those desired outcomes. Along the process, ensuring that it is inclusive. So making sure that they are doing things in a way that identify multiple roles that fit youth and young adults within the group, and providing different types of opportunities that might be more or less a fit for different group members. As adult allies, we want to make sure that you're also being very flexible, and making sure that they're allowed to work on their timeline. This isn't yours, you know, this is their project or their activity. So recognize some teachable moments in that, but otherwise let them do their own work. And lastly, encouraging all ideas. We have been so surprised by some of the ideas that youth have brought to the table when they've done different activities, and things that we would never think of in a million years. And some of those ideas we've actually even been really hesitant to support because we weren't sure how successful it was going to be. But there's so much learning that can occur throughout that process that we encourage all ideas anyway. And that's really going to help them in their career if they're not always relying on us for their ideas, and they can instead build confidence in what they have to offer. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we have like 1 minute left. So I am going to kind of let anybody at Raise clean up or finish up what they need to, but also if you have questions, please feel free to put them directly in the chat as well. I do want to thank you guys as you're asking these things or thinking of questions for coming to this webinar. I know it's a lot of information, but please know that you have the resources here to help you work through some of these things. None of this, you know, the youth support professional side or the youth side, none of that happens overnight. And it's all individualized to what your organization does or where you all are at. So please keep that in mind.
Okay, so I don't have any questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Johan, for sharing the information about the SPAN youth chat. That's definitely something very cool to know about. Any final questions? Ali, you did a beautiful job as always. And I think one thing that has really been on our hearts when we were originally talking about this toolkit is the fact that so many of these youth work great in groups that know disability and in their teams where they're comfortable, and sometimes then leaving that team can be uncomfortable or tricky or hard. I guess I want to know if you had any personal experience with dealing with that or knowing someone that was really great in the youth group, and how did they adjust when they left it?
I think it can be mixed. And I think a lot of that has to do with how well we as support professionals are setting them up outside of our own little bubble, as you've said. I've had roles where I'm dealing directly with students or working with youth with disabilities. And regardless of my position, I always say that I want to be setting those individuals up to not ever need me. So I know that if I am doing something where the youth or young adult relies on me, I'm probably not doing something right. I think that trust and reliance are very different. So I want the youth or young adult to trust me, to feel that I am an ally, but to know that whatever is happening, those outcomes, is because of what they're doing, not because of something I'm providing for them. So I think as we think about that, as we think about sending youth off to do what they would like to do elsewhere, we make sure we keep that in mind, to keep pointing that out and to encouraging them to recognize their own individual empowerment.
Thank you so much, Ali. Well said. If you have further questions about this webinar, you will be getting the Spanish and English recording of it, the PowerPoint, and the toolkit, I believe, by the end of the week. And it will also be posted on our website forever. And so you can always watch it. And thank you, Ali. Thank you to our sign language and Spanish interpreters. And folks, I hope that you take this and then use us as a support as you as staff for parent centers or you as families start to really empower young adults with disabilities. So thank you all so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.